Every skull was facing up. That detail, the deliberate, careful positioning of 43 skulls in a perfect grid beneath the floorboards of a house in rural Oregon, was disturbing enough on its own. But it was what had been pressed into each eye socket that made Dr. Mara Voss sit down in the dirt of her own childhood bedroom and stop breathing for a full 11 seconds. Her baby teeth, all 20 of them, distributed across 43 skulls with a mathematical precision that could not have been accidental, could not have been coincidental, and could not have happened without someone who had known her since before she had a single permanent tooth in her mouth. By the end of this, you will understand what Mara found beneath those floorboards, and you will understand why the most terrifying part was not the skulls or the teeth or even the smell. It was the date carved into the foundation stone directly below where her childhood bed had stood for the first 12 years of her life. Because that date was 11 days from now. And it always had been. Mara Voss was 34 years old in the autumn of 2019 when she drove back to Creswell, Oregon for the first time in 22 years. She made the trip alone, which was typical of her. Her colleagues at the University of Washington's anthropology department described her the same way every time someone asked. Thorough, quiet, the kind of person who eats lunch at her desk and doesn't seem to notice she's doing it. She had dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with focus. She wore the same gray field jacket in October that she wore in July. She smelled faintly of soil even after showering, which she'd once laughingly told her graduate students was either professional dedication or early onset obsession. She was driving back to Creswell because her mother had died in September, quickly, from a stroke that announced itself as a headache on a Tuesday afternoon and completed its work by Thursday morning. There had been no siblings to coordinate with, no father on the scene since 1993, no real estate agent willing to deal with the property until someone cleared 22 years of accumulated living from the interior. The house at 4 Aldermore Lane sat on just under 2 acres of Douglas fir at the edge of what locals called the Back Bowl. A low depression in the land where the fog pooled on cold mornings and didn't burn off until well past noon. The kind of place where sound moved strangely, where you could hear someone walking in the tree line before you could see them, and sometimes after they had stopped. Mara pulled into the gravel drive at just after 2 in the afternoon on October 8th. The house looked smaller than memory had built it, which is how houses always look when you return to them as adults, but it also looked wrong in a way she couldn't place for several minutes. She sat in her truck with the engine off, studying the front porch, the dark windows, the way the gutters had pulled away from the eave on the left side. Then she understood. Every curtain in the house was closed. Her mother had lived alone, had no reason to perform privacy, and in all of Mara's childhood memories, her mother had hated curtains. Hated them with a specific verbal intensity. I didn't move to the woods to look at fabric, I moved here to look at trees. But every window was covered, and the fabric pressed flush against the glass, and no light came through from inside even though the power was still running. Mara told herself it was nothing. Grief does strange things to people, and she reminded herself, a scientist. She catalogued the observation and filed it away. The smell hit her the moment she unlocked the front door. Not decay. She knew that smell well enough to have ceased fearing it years ago. This was something older and drier. Mineral. The smell of excavated earth, of open sediment, of ground that has been sealed and then broken. The smell of her field sites. The smell of graves. And what Mara found when she followed that smell down the hallway to her childhood bedroom, and knelt down, and pressed her palm to the floorboard that shifted slightly beneath her weight, that moment rewrote every memory she had ever trusted about the first 12 years of her life. She pulled her flashlight from her jacket pocket. She pressed her fingers into the gap between the boards. She pulled. The boards came up easier than they should have. That was the first wrong thing. Old hardwood flooring in a house this age. Mid-century construction, pine subfloor beneath Douglas fir planking, nailed down and swollen with decades of Pacific Northwest humidity. Should have required a pry bar, should have screamed and resisted and left splinters in her palms. Instead, the section lifted cleanly like a lid, like something designed to be opened. 3 boards, she realized, had been cut free of their nails at some point and reset without fastening. Waiting. The edges were smooth where they met. Someone had sanded them. Mara set the boards aside and aimed her flashlight down into the gap. The space beneath the floor was wrong in its dimensions. Crawl spaces in houses like this ran maybe 18 inches deep, Enough for pipes, enough for rodents, not enough for anything else. But her flashlight beam dropped and kept dropping before it found the bottom. 3 feet. Maybe 4. The ground had been excavated, deliberately deepened, and leveled. She could see now, smoothed out by hand into a flat earthen floor that had been allowed to dry and settle until it was almost as hard as concrete. She lowered herself through the opening. The smell intensified the moment her boots touched the ground. That mineral dryness she'd noticed in the hallway was stronger here. Ancient and close, but layered underneath it was something else. Something organic. Sweet in a way that wasn't pleasant. The smell of preserved things. The smell of intention. She swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The grid came into focus the way a photograph develops. Gradually, piece by piece, her brain refusing to assemble the full image until it had no choice. First she saw 1, then 3, then a row of 7, spaced with a precision that made her breathing change before her thoughts had caught up. They were arranged in a 6x7 pattern with 1 additional skull centered at the head of the formation. 43 in total. Every one facing up. Every one oriented identically, the occipital bone resting flat against the packed earth. The cranium tilted back at an angle that made them look like an audience watching a ceiling that wasn't there. And the eye sockets. The eye sockets. She had to get closer before she was sure. She needed to be sure. This is what she told herself. I am a scientist, I need to confirm what I am seeing before I respond to it. And so she crouched beside the nearest skull and brought the flashlight beam in close and looked. Pressed into each orbit, seated against the bone as carefully as gemstones in a setting, were small white objects. Smooth, slightly translucent at the edges. She recognized their shape before she recognized what they were, because she had held them before, years ago, wrapped in tissue in a small ceramic dish on the bathroom counter of this house, left out for the tooth fairy who never actually came, because her mother always forgot, and Mara always pretended she hadn't noticed the tooth still sitting there in the morning. Her baby teeth. She was as certain as it was possible to be. She had lost them over a span of 6 years, the first at age 5, the last at 11. All 20. And they were here, beneath her feet, beneath the floor where she had slept for 12 years, distributed across 43 skulls with a regularity that suggested a system. Some teeth appearing in multiple sockets, spaced equidistant from each other, others placed singly like a period at the end of a sentence. Mara sat down in the dirt. She would later tell the Cresswell County Sheriff's deputy, a tired man named Greer who had the patient expression of someone who had given up being surprised by people, that she sat there for approximately 11 seconds before she could move again. 11 seconds of total stillness. She counted them later, working backward from when she remembered her lungs beginning to function, and the number felt meaningful in a way she couldn't articulate, the way certain numbers feel meaningful when you are standing at the edge of something large. She stood up. She began to document. This is what Mara Voss did when the world became unmanageable. She worked. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and switched on the camera, and she moved through the grid methodically, photographing each skull from directly above, then from the sides, then in close-up, preserving the spatial relationship between each one, noting the measurements she could estimate by eye, dictating observations in a low, steady voice that did not shake until the 41st skull. The 41st skull was smaller than the others. Much smaller. She had been so absorbed in the pattern, in the documentation, in the professional distance she was using like a scuba tank to breathe down here, that she had not registered the size variation until she was almost on top of it. She crouched again. She looked. The cranial volume was wrong for an adult. Wrong for a teenager. This was the skull of a child. A young child. She scanned the remaining 2. Also children. The 3 juvenile skulls were clustered at the far end of the grid, in the final row, slightly separated from the others by a gap of perhaps 8 inches, a deliberate margin that made them feel both included and apart. She had a thought that she set down immediately, like a hot pan. She picked it back up because she was a scientist and the thought was relevant. The teeth in a child's eye sockets are permanent teeth. Fully formed. She looked closely, and her light confirmed it. Only the adult skulls held the small, translucent shapes she recognized as her own. The children's sockets held something different. Larger. Whiter. Teeth that had never been anyone's baby teeth. Mara stood up and breathed and told herself that this was solvable. That there was an explanation. that the world did not actually contain things that could not be explained, and she had spent 15 years proving that the world yielded its secrets to patience and method and the refusal to flinch. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found when she swept her flashlight toward the foundation wall at the far end of the space, the wall that sat directly beneath where the head of her childhood bed had stood for 12 years above her sleeping body, carved into the stone. Not scratched, not painted, not chalked. Carved with something sharp and patient and certain. The grooves deep enough to still hold shadow after decades of darkness. A date, October 19th, 2019. 11 days from now. She stood very still. She read it again. She read it a third time. Then she turned the flashlight back to the full grid, slowly, because she needed to understand the thing that had just arrived at the edge of her thinking. The thing she had not let herself think until this moment. She counted the skulls again. 43. She counted the rows. 6 by 7 plus the single skull at the head of the formation. 43 skulls. She was 34 years old. She had been alive for approximately 12,500 days. She had lost her last baby tooth at 11 years old, which meant this arrangement, this precise, deliberate placement of her teeth in these sockets, had to have been constructed over time. Not all at once. Progressively. Tooth by tooth, year by year, requiring access to this space on multiple occasions. Requiring someone who was present in her life during those years. Someone who had been here, in this house, in this room, collecting what she left behind. Her mother had lived in this house for 22 years after Mara left. Her mother had lived in this house alone. Mara stood there in the cold earth of the place she was born into, and the flashlight began to shake in her hand, and she made herself look at the date one more time to confirm that she had read it correctly, and that was when she heard, from directly above her, the sound of a floorboard settling under weight. The soft, specific percussion of someone stepping carefully into a room. The room she had just climbed down from. The room where the boards she had lifted and set aside were now, she realized, making a small sliding sound, as though being picked up from the other side. As though being set back into place. As though being closed. The boards were moving. Mara heard it with the clarity you only get in absolute silence. That dry, wooden whisper of sanded edges sliding against each other. The soft friction of something being handled with deliberate care. Not dropped. Not thrown. Placed. Whoever was up there was not panicking. Whoever was up there had done this before, or had imagined doing it so many times that it had become a kind of muscle memory. A rehearsal finally becoming the performance. She did not scream. She wants you to understand that. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid in a way that had moved past the usual geography of fear, past her throat and her stomach and into something deeper, something cellular, as though her blood had been informed before her mind caught up, but because screaming felt like the wrong answer, like it would confirm something, like it would give the darkness above her exactly the sound it had been waiting for. Instead, she turned off her flashlight. Total darkness. The kind you don't get anymore in cities, in suburbs, in most of the inhabited world. The kind of darkness that has weight and temperature and smell. She could feel the cold earth through the soles of her boots. She could feel the air, which was still and dry and carried that mineral sweetness that she now understood was not the smell of ancient things but of maintained things. This space had been cared for, visited, kept dry, kept sealed. The smell of a kept secret. The smell of love so distorted it had turned into something unrecognizable. Above her, the last board settled into place with a sound like a door closing at the end of a long hallway. And then nothing. No footsteps retreating. No creak of floorboards shifting under departing weight. Whoever had closed the floor above her was still standing there. She could feel it the way you feel someone watching you from across a dark room. Not with your skin exactly, but with something older than skin. Some survival mechanism that predates language. She counted heartbeats because counting was the only thing keeping her thoughts in a single file. On the 14th beat, the voice came through the floor. Low, patient, unmistakably familiar in the way that something you've heard in dreams is familiar, not quite anchored to a specific memory, but known in the body before the mind can process it. Asterisk Mara. I kept them safe for you. Asterisk. Her mother was dead. She had identified the body. She had signed the paperwork. She had watched them wheel the gurney out of the hospital room and stood very still and felt the particular silence of a world with one fewer person in it. The voice above her was her mother's voice. She pressed her back against the foundation wall, against that carved date, against the grooves of October 19th, 2019, and she breathed and she thought, and she did not turn her flashlight back on because something in her understood that seeing was the wrong tool right now. Hearing was what mattered. Listening. The thing she had, perhaps, failed to do for 34 years with the sufficient depth the situation had apparently required. I kept them safe, the voice said again, and this time she heard something in it she hadn't caught the first time. Not menace, not cruelty, something worse, tenderness. The specific tenderness of absolute conviction. The voice of someone who had done a terrible thing for what they believed, in the total darkness of their own heart, was an act of devotion. Mara found her voice. She kept it steady, because she was, underneath the fear and the grief and the 43 skulls and the date carved in stone, still herself. Still the woman who ate lunch at her desk and smelled of soil and did not flinch. Safe from what? She said, and her voice rose through the floorboards like smoke. Silence. A long silence. And then the sound of slow movement, not footsteps exactly, more like weight redistributing, like someone settling into a posture they had been preparing for a long time. From the ones who were supposed to come before, the voice said. 43 of them. I found them in the earth when we built this house. Before you were born. Before you existed in anything but the idea of you. And I understood what they were. I understood what they'd been waiting for. Mara's archaeological mind, the part that never fully disengaged, that processed the world in sediment layers and timelines, assembled something in the dark. She thought of the adult skulls, dozens of them. She thought of the 3 smaller ones clustered apart. She thought of the teeth in those child-sized sockets. Not her baby teeth, not small and translucent, but full and white and belonging to someone else entirely. You put teeth in the children's sockets, Mara said. Not my teeth. Different teeth. Whose teeth? The silence this time was different. Weighted. Arriving from a place that had been rehearsed but still, at the final moment, cost something to say. The ones who came before you, her mother's voice said quietly. The ones I lost. Before you. 3 of them. I lost 3 before I had you, and when I found those skulls, I understood that something was using them as markers. As a ledger. I didn't let it finish the account. I started a different one. And there it was. The shape of it. The full, terrible, human shape of the thing beneath her feet. A woman who had suffered losses so profound they had reorganized her understanding of the world. Who had found 43 skulls in the ground and, instead of calling anyone, had looked at them with the eyes of someone who had already lost everything and decided she was looking at a system, a mechanism, a hunger in the earth that could be redirected, appeased, bargained with, who had spent decades maintaining that bargain, preserving each tooth her daughter lost, pressing them into those waiting sockets one by one, year by year, believing with absolute certainty that she was paying a toll. Keeping something at bay. Keeping Mara alive by feeding a debt that she alone could see. The date in the stone. October 19th, 2019. Not a threat. A deadline. Her mother had known. Had known for years, perhaps decades, that the arrangement had a terminus. That 43 skulls required 43 completed payments and hers would run out. That when the last tooth was placed and the debt was settled, the ledger would close. And so she had died in September. She had died before October 19th. And Mara, who did not believe in any of this, who had built her entire life on the principle that the earth yielded rational secrets to rational methods, had come back anyway. Had been brought back, she now understood, by a force entirely ordinary and entirely devastating. A daughter who needed to clear her mother's house. The voice above her had not spoken again. Mara stood in the darkness and understood that it would not. Whatever she had been hearing, grief made acoustic, her own mind under catastrophic stress, something she had no professional framework for and was not willing to name. It was finished. The account was settled because she was here, because she had come. She found the edge of the excavated wall with her hands and she climbed. She dug her fingers into the packed earth and she found the lip of the floorboards above her and she pushed, and they gave, because they had always been designed to give, and she pulled herself up into the gray afternoon light of her childhood bedroom, and she sat on the floor and she breathed. The room was empty. The boards beside her lay as she had left them. No one had moved them. No one had closed them. The house was silent in the particular way that houses are silent when they have always been silent and you've simply forgotten that houses make sounds without people in them. Pipes, settling wood, the long exhale of old structures bearing their own weight. She sat there for a long time. When Deputy Greer arrived, she showed him everything. The space, the grid, the teeth, the date in the stone. He was thorough to his credit. He called the state forensic team and they spent 11 days beneath the floor of 4 Aldermore Lane, and in the end they identified the remains of 40 individuals of varying ages, some reaching back over a century, none with traceable identities, all predating the house, all apparently interred deliberately and long before Mara's mother was born. The 3 juvenile skulls held teeth that matched dental records from 3 pregnancy losses her mother had documented in a journal found inside the walls, wrapped in cloth, dated across a span of 5 years. The house was demolished in November. The date in the stone, October 19, 2019, passed without incident. Mara spent it at her desk at the University of Washington, eating lunch alone, smelling faintly of soil. She told no one what she felt that day. She documented it in her own private notes, in the same careful language she used for field reports, and the final line read, * no observable event. Baseline normal. Proceeding, *. But here is the thing that stays with Mara Voss. The thing she has not written down because she cannot figure out the professional language for it, and she is unwilling to say it in any other kind. When she finally climbed out of the ground and sat in the gray light of that room, she looked at her hands, dirty from the earth, shaking slightly, real and warm, and she understood something she could not unlearn. Her mother had believed she was protecting her. Every collected tooth, every preserved piece of her daughter's discarded childhood, had been an act of terrified love expressed through the only ritual that made sense in a world that had taken 3 children before they had the chance to breathe. The skulls were real. The grief was real. And the space between those 2 facts, between what is real and what people build inside the real to survive it, that space is where most of the horror actually lives. Not in the dark. Not beneath the floorboards. In the distance between what a person fears and what they will do, alone, without witness, in the long years of an ordinary life, to keep the people they love from disappearing into the earth. 43 skulls, and not one of them as frightening as that. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.